Hello and welcome to another episode of Speaking. Today we have a very special guest with us. It is Padma Shri Dr. Meenakshi Jain, who is a very senior political scientist and historian. She is the author of some really good books on different aspects of history, and here she is to speak about very issues which are pertinent for the country and for Indian history. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for taking out time and coming to our
Thank you for
podcast.
inviting me.
Ma'am, one of my first question is, which you would feel is something that you have been asked again and again. Indian history is highly contested and most of the time political. What is the interplay between politics and history in contemporary India?
See, I just want to go back to the British period. Uh, in the British period, the rewriting of Indian history began under colonial supervision. The British wanted to present history in a particular perspective, and they employed some Bengalis to translate into English certain valuable Bengali texts. Now, it is very surprising that three Bengali employees of the East India Company, they at once grasped the significance of what the British were attempting. And the first three histories in modern times of India were written by Indian employees of the East India Company in Calcutta. So it is not that people were not aware. And these textbooks, three textbooks, they are so important because they show an awareness of Indians to the power play between history writing and the powers that be. And they decided that they will not allow the company to steamroll over the writing of Indian history. So, this is a most remarkable development. Now, to come to a little later time, during the freedom movement, we have the rise of many eminent Indians, historians, who wrote in the backdrop of British colonial power. And these historians, we can roughly call them nationalist historians. By nationalist historian, I have to clarify that nationalism cannot be equated with communal. Don't equate nationalism with communal. If I say they were nationalist historians, that doesn't mean that they were communal historians.
Yes.
So these people, they wrote such fantastic works on various aspects of Indian history, administration, polity, social conditions, education. And they were so qualified. They were skilled epigraphists. They could read inscriptions. They knew Sanskrit. They knew Persian. They knew the regional vernaculars. So they were very rooted in the indigenous source material for writing history.
Yes.
So this was the school that was the cream of Indian intelligentsia in the colonial and just on the eve of independence. And their works are works that can be measured today against the modern criteria of writing history, and they will not be found wanting because they were so skilled. The problem began shockingly some decades after independence.
Right.
Normally, we are told that history is written by the victor.
Yes.
So, in independent India, the history should have been written by the victors who were the Indians who had won the freedom against colonial rule.
Yes.
But surprisingly, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and continuing till today, the dominant narrative, Indian history was written through imported eyes.
Yes.
It was written on the basis of an imported ideology, and it had certain objectives. The objective was to decry, demean, and denigrate anything that was of this land. So, Indian history before the medieval era is presented as a history of caste oppression,
Yes.
women's suppression,
Yeah.
economic exploitation, Brahmin tyranny, and it goes on and on. Why was it presented in this way? The whole point is that one generation before that, Indian historians were writing history in a totally different way.
Yes.
So, the backdrop, according to me, is the partition of the country along religious lines. Now, it is a fact that the country was partitioned on religious lines
Yes.
on the basis of the demand of a section of society. It is ironic that that section of society which demanded partition actually did not migrate to Pakistan. They stayed behind.
Yes.
Now, this is something that can be easily verified because
course.
now even the exact figures are available.
Yes, ma'am.
So, what has this got to do with the rewriting of history? When a substantial section of society which demanded partition did not go to Pakistan, then this group of historians said Indian history has to be rewritten. So, what are the points that have to be rewritten? Indian history before the medieval period is a dark chapter. There's nothing glorious about it, there's nothing golden about it. It's exploitation, exploitation. Now, the story begins actually in the medieval period. So, we know what happens in the medieval period. We have the advent of the Arabs and Turks and the abiding memory that we still today have. We still means a majority of the majority community, let me put it that way. We have the abiding memory as a period of devaluation, degeneration, assault on the civilizational heritage of India, exemplified in the destruction of temples.
Yes.
Best exemplified. So, that is the abiding memory that even if a student is not a student of history and just a lay person, what do you remember about the medieval period? They will remember it as a time when our sacred sites and sacred structures were attacked. So, this new school of writing begins in Aligarh and it tries to show that the advent of the Arabs and Turks had nothing to do with religion. Religion played no part in the medieval period. The story of the Arabs and Turks is a story of them being attracted by the wealth of India. So, Mahmud Ghaznavi is regarded as a robber who came to rob the temples of their wealth. So, this lack of empathy, when you write about a country, especially about your own country, you have some empathy with that. But this total disregard for the heritage, actually contempt for the heritage, it begins in the 1970s and it is something that we have not been able to fittingly answer back till today. So in India, it's not a question of the victors writing the history, it is still history being written through an imported ideology and not through Indian eyes.
Ma'am, I agree with you because when I was teaching this, I teach a legal history course, and when I was teaching them about sati, and that was one of the thing. In the reading, it came about that sati was made a big issue by the
Yes.
British, but the actual instances of sati were negligible.
And
And they were largely in Bengal. And even if when I say largely in Bengal, a minuscule section was, and there were few instances here and there, but it was made out to be by the Britishers themselves that sati was the biggest blot on how Indian women were treated and stuff like that. And it is an instance of a living case of how women were treated. So that was one of the projections which I found problematic. The other was also about saying that destruction of temples was described largely as not being driven by religious reasons in most of the writings, it is seen as being as a matter of state policy, that a sovereign shall exercise his right to practice state policy. So they are even justified on these grounds.
I will first answer your question on Sati because I'm delighted that you've asked this question. I've written a book on Sati.
Yes, I know. That is
So-
why I asked you.
So, it is surprising that why did they choose Bengal? Because Bengal was the seat of their power in India.
Yes.
At that time, their rule was mainly confined to Bengal.
Yes.
All right. Now, it is ironic that Bengal we remember today as the harbinger of modern India. So, a place which is supposed to be giving birth to modern India should actually be presented as the epicenter of Sati is absolutely astonishing and astounding. That itself.
Yes.
And in Bengal, as you said, there was no tradition of Sati.
No.
Sati was a custom that was limited. It was confined to the martial communities. Because the husband died in battle, the wife felt she had to meet an equally heroic end. So it was a very minuscule. In my book, I've tried to catalog the number of satis that were actually performed. So, and the whole point is that when William Bent, and why was this agitation by the companies? Because the missionaries wanted the right to come to India and convert. And the British Parliament was not giving them that right. So they had to convince the British Parliament that, it's such a land of evil and darkness that, women are being burnt all the time. So they cooked up figures. They commissioned a private survey. Can you imagine commissioning a private survey in Calcutta? Calcutta. That, give us a report of how many women are immolating themselves every month or whatever it is. And, today, you will not find any Sati temple in Bengal. When we were young and we used to go to Mathura, we used to see so many of these widows from Bengal with shaven heads. So the custom there was that women who were widows went to Vrindavan. The epicenter of Sati was Rajasthan, confined to the Rajput community. And even today, Sati temples exist in Rajasthan, and it is whoever commits a Sati is regarded as heroic and noble. Whether we agree with that or not is immaterial. And how is it that the moment William Bentinck said Sati is illegal, from the next day there was no Sati in Bengal? I mean, it is like there was no Twitter, there was no newspapers. How did the order reach every village?
Yes.
And after independence, the government in parliament has given the figure of 40 cases of satis since 1947. All right? These are parliamentary figures. Not one of those 40 cases is listed from Bengal. And 2/3 of them are from Rajasthan. So that is, why it's so important to write your own history. Because every school child, you ask, tell me one thing about William Bentinck, he'll say, ma'am, he abolished sati. I say, it has got so deeply embedded in our psyche, sati and female infanticide. I said, I don't know anyone who ever had a sati in their family.
And like ma'am, they said that the British lifted the ban on widow remarriage and that in 1856, and that caused the revolt of 1857 because people were very upset that their traditions are interfered with. First of all, there is no, when I teach the students, I tell them, first of all, there is no case of ban.
There is no case of ban. And
Which
the
the British are lifting.
No, and the earliest case I will give you, the Rig Ved,
Yes.
has this funeral hymn.
Yeah.
And that is which they mistranslated to show that the religious injunction to women who are widows to burn themselves. Now, in that funeral hymn, the hymn says that after a husband has died, the woman is supposed to moist her eyes with ghee and lie before the body and then get up and resume her place in the world. So when the Rig Ved is saying that after the necessary, ceremonies, then you get up and resume your place in the world, then where is the religious sanction for it?
Yes.
All this only makes me so concerned
Yes.
and anxious about the need to reclaim our past.
Ma'am, it is a real issue because the students are coming and we are teaching them these kinds of histories. Of course, we have to revise them, but they're from school. They have come with
Yes.
such strong
Yes.
ideas that it becomes very difficult
Yes.
at university level
Yes.
to change it.
Yes.
Because it's 12 years versus 3 years or 2 years.
But Sati, my book, I'm not trying to praise myself, but that one stone that I threw, that mirror has cracked. So, like in many universities abroad also,
Yes.
they no longer say that Sakti was a very common custom,
Yes. Yes.
So they've started modifying.
Ma'am, that leads on to my second question because you have raised this question about the colonial government, which had a big role in shaping our history and our historical sites. So, what has been your understanding of to what extent and why did the colonial state have such a big role to play?
No, I don't know whether they had a big role to play because, I am right now working on the colonial education policies.
Policy.
And it has come as a surprise to me that, the pushback from educated Indians was so strong that the British never had a clean slate to write on. The resistance, even to the imposition, even to the declaration of English as the language in Thomas Macaulay's Minute. 3 years after Macaulay submitted that minute on education, which made English the language of education, 3 years after that, the residents of Bengal, in protest, they submitted a petition to the British government in Calcutta in Sanskrit. They submitted a protest memorandum to the British in Sanskrit. And what did that memorandum say? They say that we recognize the need to learn English for business and for government jobs. We are not grudging that, and we will happily learn English for that. But kindly understand that our civilizational heritage is not linked to English, it is linked to Sanskrit and the vernaculars. So, I don't know whether we are right in saying that the British, had complete freedom to write our history.
The way they wanted it.
I don't think so. There were historians who wrote, like Vincent Smith, etc. But I don't think the Indians were denied the right to protest, and they did protest. So the protest by the Indians against the British policies is something that I've come to appreciate and admire now. Because you see, it's important to study everything in depth. Because when you study in depth, a whole new world opens before you.
Yes, of course.
I'm not saying that there were not Englishmen or company men who wrote Indian history. Vincent Smith is the most notorious example. They wrote on Indian art, etc. But to say that they were facing no resistance is incorrect. And I don't know of many people who would have subscribed to their writing of Indian history or even endorsed it.
So, ma'am, then ultimately it comes to the question of history is what historians write. And as a historian who's written several books, what is the role historians have in privileging one history over another kind of history?
Now, this is a very loaded question. I'm not sure what you mean by privileging one kind of history over another.
Ma'am, what I mean is a particular kind of history is shown as very glorious, and another history is shown as very something which is always on the like, for example, we've been their periodization of history is now again
Okay.
this
All right.
period, Mughal
I
period, colonial
understood.
period.
So
Yeah.
now, since the condemnation seems to be of ancient Indian history, because it is said that we are glorifying. Now, I want to present to you certain features of Indian history which can be verified by you and your viewers. And all the information is available on archive.org. So it is not something that is inaccessible. And I'm not asking you to accept what I'm saying at face value. I'm inviting you to cross check. Now, what are the features? First of all, this feature that Hindu civilization was imposed on the populace by the so called elite caste of Brahmins.
Yes, this is one of the
All
major
right.
arguments. Yes.
So, and then that is what I'll answer. Then I will talk to you about the evidence on female participation,
Yes.
etc.
Yes.
Now, we've all heard of Sanchi.
Yes.
Sanchi is a stupa which is now a very important tourist site. It was built by Ashoka.
Yes.
The earlier stupa was very small. Then, in the time of Ashoka, it was slightly enlarged. Subsequently, 100 years after Ashoka, the present stupa was further enlarged. Now, I'm giving you this example because in Sanchi, we have found over 630 in situ inscriptions. In situ inscriptions means that they are there in the very place where they were first planted. So 630 inscriptions we have of the time that the Sanchi stupa was constructed. Now these inscriptions have been collected, compiled and translated into English. Now of these 630 inscriptions, only 3 mention royalty. Only 3 mention royalty, and they do not mention some major king or the donation of a king. They mention that this person was working in the court of this king. So it is reference to kings is only marginal. Most of the inscriptions, that is 630 minus 3, those inscriptions are inscriptions by ordinary people, nuns, monks, traders, women, labor. And they give, the inscriptions are that we have donated this slab, we have donated this gateway, we have donated this pillar. Because, no one person was rich enough to donate the whole thing.
Yes.
So, people in a village would collect together and say, we are contributing this to Sanchi. So that shows popular participation in making this civilization. And there is one gateway. It is still standing in Sanchi. You can see the gateway, and the inscription on the gateway says that we are the ivory workers from Vidisha. Our profession is we Hatida, ivory workers. We have come from Vidisha to carve this gate, and we are gifting this to the stupa.
Yes.
Can you imagine? Now those ivory workers were not kings or businessmen
Yes,
or whatever.
of course.
So it is the popular participation. This has been one of the misrepresentations of Indian history, that it was a top-down
Yes.
affair,
Yes.
and it was the elite caste going down. This is not true on the basis of evidence which can be verified and checked by anyone who listens to the podcast. All right. So Sanchi, I've given you one example. Now I want to give you the example of women participation. Jains, they used to have these small homage tablets.
Yes.
They were the size of a mobile or smaller than the mobile. So they were these homage stones. They were donated by these women in honor of, it would have some sacred symbol like a swastik, whatever. And most of them have been found from Mathura. 99.9% of the Ayag Pattas have been donated by women. And, their profession is listed because they say, I'm the one who did, because it's a matter of pride for them.
Yes, of course.
That, I'm donating this. I'm from this village. Another one person says, I'm donating it with my daughter-in-law. So, someone is the wife of a village headman. I mean, all kinds of professions, but none of them is a queen. And they're all small homage stones in Mathura. 99.9% of them are by women. So, what does it tell you about the status of society? Was it a, a society of oppression, female oppression? Then the earliest Saraswati, the earliest image of Saraswati that we have found also comes from Mathura. It is now headless and the arms are broken, but luckily the inscription on the pedestal has survived. And that inscription says that I am a metal worker, lohar, and I am donating this image of Saraswati. So you have female participation. You have this metal worker donating an image of Saraswati, and this cannot be disputed because the inscription is there. You have 630 inscriptions from Sanchi. And just one more example, because you'll think I'm going on defending, but I'm just presenting facts. I'm not asking anyone to endorse what I'm saying, because that is not the job of a historian.
Yes, of course.
The job of a historian is to arouse interest, create awareness, and a desire to learn and to seek. All these things you can, look on the net. Now, in the Western Ghats, there are many, many cave temples. And the cave temples, they have, caves of Buddhists, Jains, and Hindus. I mean, these are loose terms. I'm talking about today's terminology.
Yes.
That time, this terminology was not used. But all the caves exist alongside. So to say that the Hindus were killing Buddhists and the Buddhists were killing Jains, but please show us the evidence. So all these caves, again, they are donated, means they have to be dug out. No? So the caves are donated by ordinary people. And there are caves where a worshipper of Ganesh is donating a Jain cave. So, it is all the parts of India, whether you go to Ajanta Ellora, whether you go to Mahabalipuram, whether you go to Udaygiri, whether you go to Khajuraho, Jain, Buddhist, and Hindu temples existed alongside. There is no place where you will say only one community. Khajuraho, the Khajuraho kings were either followers of Vishnu or Shiva. So all their temples are there. Then the other side, their ministers were mostly Jains. So in that same complex, their ministers also have their temples. And from outside, you cannot make out whether it's a Jain temple or a Buddhist temple or a Hindu temple, because the architecture is the same. So how are the kings allowing Jain structures to come in the middle of Hindu structures? The point is that so much poison has been spread by this willful distortion that it is going to take God knows how long to get this out of our system. Even today, when all this controversy about Sambhal and whatever, so you'll see so many of these people coming on TV. They're telling the Hindus, you used to build on Buddhist sites. Please tell us the Buddhist sites on which Hindus built temples. Because that whole self-loathing, that you have no empathy. I'm not saying you have to be an admirer, but you have to have empathy. If I am writing a history of your family, I should have basic empathy. No? I cannot start with such an antagonistic tone. I mean, this is a given. This is a given.
Yes.
It is absolutely distressing. Udaygiri was a very famous site which was developed by Chandragupta of the Gupta dynasty.
Yes.
And it's a very important tourist site today. And Chandragupta he called himself Param Bhagwat. Param Bhagwat means great devotee of Vishnu. Now that site is there. Anyone can Google it or go and visit. Now next to the main cave of Chandragupta is the cave of his minister. His minister was a Shiva Bhakt. And there's an inscription in that cave which says, I invited the emperor, the king, Chandragupta to come to this cave. He visited this cave. He visited the cave, and there's a image of Chandragupta visiting this place. So, if he was a follower of Vishnu, why did he allow his minister to build a cave for Shiv, and why did he go there? And then a little distance, you find the Jain caves. So, so much poison has been infused into writing the narrative of Indian history that I don't know how many generations it will take I'm not saying that everything is perfect. There is no country and no civilization in the world which we can call a perfect civilization. See, the impact of time and the unfolding of history does result in certain distortions. It is all over the world. I'm not saying that even if it was a glorious beginning, I'm not saying that the impact of developments did not have any bearing on our history. Of course it did. But the point is to begin the story from the impact and not to go to the roots, I don't think is very honest way to do it. We should begin at the beginning and then say these these discrepancies and irregularities crept in at some point, and there was always an awareness that these need to be addressed. I don't know how many reformers or politicians you can name, I cannot name anybody, who said that the depressed classes should remain depressed.
Who would say that? Yes.
Yeah. So they said we must work to the upliftment of these people.
And it's one after the other.
One after the other.
Yes.
So the point is, whether it has taken us a long time, we have to understand that for 1,000 years we were not the masters of
our own destinies.
So, but we were always conscious of it. And even in the worst times, we remained true to our heritage. We remained conscious of the need to overcome the weaknesses that had crept in. We have social reformers right from the beginning.
Ma'am, I agree with you because it is very, very strange that we keep saying about caste and caste-based discrimination, but the very people who were documenting caste and tabulating it were the British. And they did it for a good amount of time till 1931 when they stopped
and
it.
When I totally agree with you, when the British decided that they will do the enumeration of castes, see, they went to the various villages or wherever they went, and they would ask a person, what is your caste? So he would say, I don't know. Because they only knew jati.
Yes.
You see that I know my jati because that is my role in my community. If I am whatever I am, that is the service that I render to my community in my village and locality.
Like a carpenter, lohar.
Whatever.
Yes.
So they are professions.
Yes.
Now the British say, you please, you have to tell us which caste. So they were totally amazed and shocked. But how do we decide? We don't know which caste. Supposing a carpenter is asked, please place yourself in the 4 varnas. Where are you? He will not know. Then, soon enough, the Indians, they realized that's a golden opportunity to shift from Shudra Varna, for example, to Kshatriya Varna. So the number of people who availed of this to what is called upward mobility.
Yes, upward mobility.
So, the whole thing is so distorted. It's very difficult to even begin to unravel what has happened.
Ma'am, another thing which has become very controversial and very thing is about Hindu reclamation of sites. And it is very contested. It is very problematic for some people. And how can this happen? How much we are going to reclaim? And where will we stop?
I have to ask you one question, which comes to my mind whenever I hear of this. For example, at Sambal, etc., etc. I will answer that question. But a question that always comes to my mind is, imagine what happened to our forefathers in the medieval period when they saw one sacred structure after another being demolished and no outrage.
No outrage.
So, I think we have to pay homage to our ancestors who survived and still did not give up the important basis of our heritage, which is temple and image worship.
Yes.
Now, this contentious issue, I don't understand what the contention is because, first of all, the recovery has been so slow and so small. You know, one success is
Yes.
Ayodhya,
Yes.
which took us 500 years.
Yes.
And that also after the court gave a unanimous judgment. So even if we leave aside what happened before independence, it took us 70 years after we became an independent country to get back something on which all the evidence was on the temple side. In the court, the judiciary, the judges in the Allahabad High Court who were hearing this case, they asked the Masjid party, we have to decide on the basis of evidence, and the Hindu or the temple party is producing this evidence. You also produce some evidence of your presence at that site from 1528, when the mandir was demolished, till 1858, that is a good 300 years later, when we first hear your voice. From 1528 till 1858, the Masjid party was not able to present any evidence in court that they were there, which means it is possible that it was a case of smash and run away. You smash, there may not be that many people to offer namaz there.
And they were not offering namaz for the longest time.
So the longest time,
It is not an important site.
ठीक है, it's important because Ram was born there.
Yeah.
So that is the importance of that site.
Yes.
But the whole point is that the story of where will it stop? I mean, who am I to decide where it will stop? It is the people who will decide. I'm not some judge sitting anywhere, or I have a command, a magic wand that I will. This is the wheel of time. The wheels of time, they move at their own pace and nobody can dictate. All right? This 500 years, so there is the reclamation. Where will it stop? It hasn't even started, to ask, if you ask me. No. In Kashi,
Yes. There's
Yes.
no question about it in
no,
Kashi.
I'm saying something else.
Yes.
The temple was destroyed again and again,
Yes. Yes.
which has been documented. The last time it was destroyed was on orders of Aurangzeb.
Yes.
All right?
Yes.
But even when the temple was destroyed, it did not mean that the temple party stopped going there, because they had access to that temple all the time. How do we know this? Because in 1937, the district court, Varanasi district court, asked 15 leading residents of Kashi to come and depose before it. So they were all respected people. And they all said that we go there. The court asked, do you have any problem? No, we go there every day. We go there every day. They say that the worship starts at 3 in the morning and at 12 at night it is stopped. So from 3 o'clock, people go on coming there. Court said, what do you do? When you go there, what do you do? So they said, we proceed in this order to honor and worship and venerate our deities. So they tell the court, first step to this deity, then to this. Many of the statues are there in the so-called masjid. Many have been destroyed, but we remember those gods were there. So then we throw rice at some empty spaces to seek forgiveness of the deities whom we may have forgotten. So the masjid may have been there, but it does not mean that the site was closed. It was closed to the temple party in 1993 by the UP government after the demolition of
Places of Worship Act.
No, after the... So, till 1993,
There was no.
there was no stopping them.
Yes.
And as you say, we are far from reclamation. We are just barely there. you know, and
And ma'am, you can see the plinth and the walls.
Arey,
It's
but
just so
the
parent.
the testimony of people of that time.
Is there a need for a testimony when you can see the plinth
If your
and the
eyes
wall?
are closed, then maybe the ears will listen. So, and in Mathura,
Yes.
it's a very tragic story.
Mm-hmm.
The Hindu claim has been well documented.
Mm.
But what is very, very disturbing,
Mm.
that shows how far we are from reclaiming,
Mm.
is that in 1968,
Mm.
a government at the center
Mm.
and a government in Uttar Pradesh collaborated and gave 3 acres of land of Katra Keshav Dev to the Eidgah party. Now, till that time, the Eidgah party in the entire British period, it filed so many cases in the court, and the court went on saying, "You have no case, please go." Now, where are we? We are very far from reclamation, because even what we had, we are giving 3 acres.
And ma'am, not many people know about it, that the land has been given.
Yes, in
Not many people.
1968.
Yes, nobody knows, by the way.
I've written a book on this, by the way. Now the point is, you tell me.
I also didn't
No,
know this.
I am asking you, what are you talking about reclamation? Sambhar mein, bhai, Aine Akbari says na, and it is a fact that there is an inscription there. Now, there is a doubt about everything, that, Aine Akbari is mentioning it in present tense, so it means that the mandir was there. Arey bhai, the point is, if you are free from any guilt or any association, then what prevents you from carrying out a survey? Why do you,
Yes.
prohibit a survey? If somebody comes to my house and says that, you have kept opium here and we want to search, I will say, please come and search. The point is, trying to block a fair examination, according to me, is not the best means to
Bolster your case.
make a case in any case. Bolster, though, is much later. So, the fact of the matter is that I think that the reclamation has hardly taken off. And, lest I'm accused of, encouraging certain activities in a certain direction, I'm no one. I'm just a bystander and a watcher. My empathy is because I've studied that history, but it does not mean that anyone can determine and direct which way this will go. 500 years, the Ayodhya movement continued on its own steam, isn't it? So, and to take umbrage at the fact that where will it go? Arey, why are you getting so nervous? The whole point is, my last question may sound incorrect, but was there any shortage of land in India ever? So, your religious structure could have been built on vacant land. Why is it that you always choose a contentious, even in Sambhal, that it's on a raised hillock? And the tradition, according to the Hindu scheme of things, was that the temple will be on a slightly elevated platform. And the masjid was always supposed to be on open ground in a marketplace, so that it's easily accessible to everyone. So, I think that many of these debates and these controversies that have arisen in recent times are doing great injustice to the Hindus. In a sense, they have suffered devastation. In the entire North India, there was no standing temple left at the beginning of the 18th century. So, if people are wanting some kind of closure, you cannot deny them. And in any case, I feel that this is something that unfurls on its own. I don't think anyone can decide to continue with it or to stop it.
But ma'am, this point is particularly interesting that land was given to the Idgah party.
Yeah.
Why isn't these things brought up into the
Ma'am,
sofa?
I've written a book
And
on this,
yes.
so I cannot be held guilty.
But ma'am, otherwise, what is your experience of it? Why it is? There are such instances which are important examples.
Yes.
Which
Yes, that's exactly the weakness of the so-called Hindu claim at reclamation. It is not confident. You know, it is seeking some kind of why media at every turn. Imagine, since the British advent, the Idgah party filed so many cases against the other party on Katra Keshav Dev. They lost each and every case. I've produced those cases in my book. And finally, the British judges, they said, you know, you are behaving like hardened criminals. These are the words they used. You have no case. You have tried to forge documents. You know, they in some of the documents that they produced in the British period, they named Katra Keshav Dev as Katra Idgah. Imagine the name also they tried to change. And the court said, you have no case. They lost every case. And then in 1968, can one believe that this can happen? And there are people who are worried about where will this go? Arey, where have we begun? You know,
yes.
we have just got Mathura after 500 years. Katra Keshav Dev, you've taken 3 acres of land from that 13.37 acres. You cannot deny it because that agreement is there. And the exact measurement of the land that was given to them is there. It's on record. Now the question will be, the interesting question, if I am to play the devil's advocate, if this present structure
Yes.
is constructed after the agreement of 1968, that means in 1947, what was this place? What was this place?
That means it was a temple structure.
So then, does the Places of Worship Act apply here or not?
It does.
Now the thing is, second point is, if you say this Idgah is before, then please tell us why is it that, where is that 3 acres of land, where did it go? In 1968, you were given 3 acres of land.
Yes, you were.
Now you're saying that your Idgah is not on that 3 acres, then where is that 3 acres? 3 acres has been given within the complex of Katra Keshav Dev.
So that means that complex does belong to that temple, and they
Of
are the ones
course.
giving it to you.
It was sold in 1944, 13.37 acres to Jugul Kishore Birla. Because the Raja Patnimal who had purchased it, he was the bank of Banaras. He and his successor said, we want to build a grand temple here, but we don't have the resources. And Krishna deserves a grand temple at his birthplace. So they told Birla, please take this land and construct the temple. And the very next day, Jugal Kishore Birla created a trust to which he entrusted the entire 13.37 acres. That trust is there. The document that the trust owns this land is there. There's no dispute about now. There's nothing in dispute. It's all black and white. So then in 1968, you're getting 3 acres from that. But why? Because you've never won a case. You've never proved that you were entitled to a portion of the land. So, it's very, very easy to point fingers at so-called aroused Hindus. But the whole point is that they have been the victims all along. Ayodhya is the only solitary case which they got after 500 years. Now, I don't think that Mathura, you can say it's a Hindu victory, because the point is that 3 acres was given in independent India.
Yes.
And Gyan Vapi, it's an ongoing thing.
Yes.
From the time that Aurangzeb demolished it till today. Till today.
It's a long time.
No, it's a long time, and Hindus have been going there. They have not surrendered.
Yes,
The thing about the Hindus is that they never surrendered their sacred site. however close they could get to it, they got to it. And to say, where will it stop? Arey, this is amazing.
Ma'am, my final question to you is, what is the Places of Worship Act being used then for? What are they trying to, because every time there's a issue of reclamation, they bring out the Place of Worship Act, and this is what it said,
Now,
and you should honor it. And
no,
this,
we are very willing to honor it. But the Places of Worship Act says
Yes.
that you have to verify what was the status of this.
Yes.
So we are only verifying. No?
Yes.
We are saying, please, we think that it's a Hindu temple,
Yes.
and you say it's a mosque. That can only be decided on the basis of investigation.
Surveys, verification, and
Whatever.
all. Yes.
And whatever the survey shows,
Yes.
it's acceptable to us.
Yes.
In any case, whatever, we are not saying that we don't accept the survey. Let the survey happen. Whatever the survey shows, we go by that. But this is a kind of red herring. They go on invoking this act. Why? To deny the possibility of an investigation.
That.
If you're saying it was never a temple, then why bombard the investigating team with brickbat, stone, etc.?
Yes.
We are saying let that happen. And whatever the survey results, we abide by that. But this is invoking, it's a deterrent. It's like a deterrent to stop the Hindus. And nothing prevents whole complexes being claimed as Waqf land. I mean, the parliament is Waqf land, temple land is Waqf land. There's no outrage about that. A temple which was 1,000 years old in Tamil Nadu has been claimed as Waqf land. New parliament is Waqf land. So there is no outrage about that. This so-called liberal secular brigade, I don't like to use that term, but it is only worried about
Hindu temple reclamation.
reclamation. And what reclamation, bhai?
One.
One.
So, ma'am, this is an ongoing debate, and Hindu reclamation will continue to be a very contested topic.
It hasn't begun.
But it will continue to be a contested topic.
That's it.
Sampal has started.
Yes.
And there are going to be things. But you have raised some very significant issues and some very interesting facts which have come out, which will be very useful for for our viewers. And thank you for the complete breakdown of things, because I think it's important for our viewers to have a complete breakdown, and then they can come to their conclusion. Ma'am, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
No.
I hope I've stayed within
Yes.
my limits of reclamation of history.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.